Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here with us tonight. Tonight, we're going to continue our Patriot series, which is celebrating the 250th year of the United States in 2026. And so we've had a couple really exciting episodes in 2026 already. We're going to continue that tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about the Battle for Boston. This was a period of time just before the Declaration of Independence came out. It essentially happened in 1768 through 1776. There were 9 years there where Boston and the colony of Massachusetts were really the hotbed of the Revolution. That's where the Revolution started, and that's where it really lit the match that was heard around the world. And you can just imagine all the different events that happened in those 9 years. We're going to go through most of them tonight, the real big ones. And we're going to take you through a timeline of those events, starting in 1768 and through 1776, when the Continental Army and George Washington, their new commander-in-chief, retook Boston from the British. And so we'll go through all the different events that happened. Of course, some of the big ones that we'll talk about tonight were the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, the Bunker Hill event that happened on the north side of Boston, and then towards the end of the program, we'll talk about how the Americans retook Boston without firing a shot. And so we'll get into all those different aspects tonight. We'll also weave in some interesting video clips for you so you can get a sense for what some of these events really were like, and you can see visually what some of the battles look like. And we're really going to give you a real sense in this 9-year span, everything that happened and how this really was the cradle of liberty for the American cause. So let's go ahead and get into Battle for Boston. The Battle for Boston and the American Revolution, a timeline, 1768 to 1776. You see up on the top left there, that's what the American flag looked like at this time before we became a country. This was during the time we were fighting for our independence. And to the left, just below that, is a map of what Boston looked like at the time. And we're going to go through all the different points on that map later in the program. But you can see how spread out it was and how surrounded Boston is by water. And so it really created a very interesting challenge, both for the British and for the Continental Army, because there were so many different points that needed to be defended and so many points that needed to be attacked to take Boston. Just below that is a picture that was depicted at the time by an artist of the siege of Boston, where the Americans and the Brits were fighting over the city itself. To the right of that is a picture of George Washington and Henry Knox, who was one of his commanders. And they're up in Dorchester Heights, and they've just pulled the cannon up there, and they're looking down at the city of Boston during the siege. And then to the right of that is a picture of George Washington when he took over command of this army during the siege of Boston. To that point, he had not been involved, but the Continental Congress actually chose him to be the commander-in-chief because they felt he was going to be a unifying figure. And they felt very much that the effort itself needed somebody with his stature. So Massachusetts colony before the Declaration of Independence, it was founded in 1630 by Puritans led by John Winthrop. The Massachusetts Bay Colony began as a religiously strict, self-governing theocracy, aiming to be a city upon a hill. It evolved into a major economic and intellectual hub for the Americas, eventually becoming the cradle of liberty and the epicenter of the revolutionary resistance against British policies like the THy&x, coercive acts, and initiating the American Revolution itself. So this is really where the American Revolution first took place, and why, of course, today they're called the Patriots. The colony rapidly grew during the Great Migration of the 1630s, establishing towns and schools, including Harvard in 1636, which of course is our oldest university, and a representative government known as the General Court in Massachusetts. The colony demonstrated early independence. Way before we fought for independence, this was the most independent of all the colonies. They managed their own affairs. They defied the crown on multiple occasions in the 1600s. And eventually it led to revocation of their charter in 1684. So the Brits already were very suspicious of and not happy with the colony of Massachusetts showing so much independence. In 1691, it was combined with the Plymouth colony to form the province of Massachusetts Bay. Due to high taxation and the crackdown on trade, Massachusetts became the center of colonial unrest, hosting events such as the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. You can see a picture there to the right of what the Massachusetts colony looked like and the Plymouth colony as they combined into one colony. And this was, of course, a time period where the colony was very much wanting its independence, even back in the 1600s. There's a great picture there to the top of the American flag at the time, which had the Union Jack in the top left, and then the 13 stripes representing the 13 colonies. And then just below that is the flag of Massachusetts in the 1770s. So here's a timeline that we're going to go through tonight. We're going to look at every single one of these events in detail. The first one started August 1st, 1768, when Boston merchants adopted a non-importation agreement, refusing to import British goods. And of course, they were very unhappy with the British and how they were being taxed and how they were being restricted in terms of trade. And there were a lot of different things they were unhappy about. This was the first time, 1768, that the Massachusetts colony and specifically Boston merchants really started to voice their displeasure against the Brits. And this movement was led by the Sons of Liberty. Of course, Samuel Adams was involved in that process, along with a bunch of other people in Boston who were agitators and organizers. And the Sons of Liberty, this was their first big event. A couple months later, October 1st, 1768, British troops occupied Boston to quell rising disobedience. So the British were so annoyed with the colonists in Massachusetts that they actually put troops into the city. Of course, that did not make anybody who lived locally very happy. March 5th of 1770, 2 years later, the Boston Massacre occurs. And we'll get into more detail about each of these events. But in that massacre, British soldiers killed 5 colonists, fueling anti-British sentiment even more than it was before. In December 16, 1773, the Boston Tea Party occurred. Again, the Sons of Liberty, 5 years later, helped organize this event where several hundred colonists came and dumped tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act, which they were very upset about. Then the next year after that, March through June of 1774, the British Parliament, at the urging of the King, passed the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists called it, the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and essentially restricting trade to just a dribble either way. And this, of course, made the colonists even more angry, as the Coercive Acts were very strict and very imposing. Later that year, in September 1774, the Suffolk Resolves were passed, calling for defiance against the Coercive Acts. So this was a reaction to the Coercive Acts and was a statement by the colonies, especially Massachusetts, but also led by several of the other colonies, to resist any British coercive acts or any other acts such as these. April 18, 1775, the next year after that, Paul Revere and William Dawes do their famous ride into the countryside to warn that the British troops are marching towards Concord. And of course, that's the famous British are coming statement by these two riders. What was interesting is there were a number of other riders, up to 20 or 30 different riders that went all over the colony of Massachusetts. But of course, the most famous were Paul Revere, because of his place in a very famous book at the time, and William Dawes. The next day, April 19, 1775, were the battles of Lexington and Concord. And of course, we had the shot heard round the world, which was the mark for the start of the war. So we had a very small skirmish in Lexington and then a little bit bigger battle, kind of the first battle of the war in Concord in 1775. That same day, the British troops marched back to Boston, kind of licking their wounds. They had lost a number of troops, and they were harassed all the way back to Boston. And the colonials from all over the countryside, all the different towns, followed the British troops all the way back to Boston and then surrounded the city and started a very long siege, almost a year long. And they called it the Siege of Boston, where militia surrounded the city, trapping British troops in the city. June 17th, 1775, during that period of the siege, Battle of Bunker Hill, which was the first real full-fledged battle between the Continental Army and the British troops. This was a major battle that happened in Charlestown, resulting in heavy British casualties. And so even though the Brits did eventually win the battle, largely because the colonials ran out of ammunition, it was really a huge shot across the bow for the British, and the shots heard around the world had finally reverberated that the colonials were not going away and that they truly had military capability. So although the Battle of Bunker Hill was actually a loss for the colonials, it really signaled to the rest of the colonies that they can really stand up to the British. July 3rd, 1775, George Washington takes command of the Continental Army in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's given command by Congress, and this was the first time that a civilian had been given command of the military. And then March 17th, 1776 was Evacuation Day. British troops and loyalists fled Boston by sea following the fortification at Dorchester Heights, where the colonials pulled over 50 cannon up to the heights. And the British, instead of trying to fight and get slaughtered, decided to get on their ships and leave. And essentially the colonials, over this several-year period, had finally gotten the British to leave, and they took Boston back. So that's the timeline we're going to go over tonight and all the different major events that we're going to talk about. So the first one, let's talk about the Non-importation Agreement. August 1st, 1768, was a widespread colonialist boycott of British goods designed to protest the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, which taxed goods like glass, lead, oil, paint, paper, and tea. Boston merchants pledged to stop importing most British goods starting January 1st, 1769, which would be that next coming year, and they did it for an entire year. It served as a major act of economic defiance and resistance, promoting local industry and unity. It was encouraged by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty. Approximately 60 merchants and traders signed the initial agreement on August 1st, with most others in the city joining shortly thereafter. The agreement, alongside similar boycotts in New York and Philadelphia, put pressure on British merchants and contributed to the eventual repeal of most of the Townshend Acts in 1770. So they actually eventually got the result they wanted. They got all these laws repealed and taken off because of this action. You can see a picture there to the right of the actual non-importation agreement itself that was sponsored by the Sons of Liberty. So really interesting. This was the first kind of kickoff of all the friction and the coming Revolutionary War that was about to happen. You can see it happened some years earlier. Next event we need to talk about is the British troops occupying Boston after that event. You can see some pictures there to the right of the British coming into town and setting up shop, taking over some people's houses, in some cases building some houses or living in tents. You can see all the different ships up above there all arriving and dropping off the British troops and some of their families. In October 1768, over 2,000 British troops began occupying Boston to quell civil unrest, enforce the 1767 Townshend Acts, and protect custom officials following protest riots. Arriving by warship at Long Wharf, soldiers established encampments on the Boston Common, significantly escalating tensions between the 16,000 residents of Boston and the Crown. There was widespread resistance to taxes and riots, particularly targeting customs officials. Major General Thomas Gage ordered regiments, including the 14th and 29th Regiment, to Boston from Ireland and Nova Scotia. The presence led to frequent, almost daily confrontations, and ultimately the Boston Massacre, which happened March 5th, 1770. So you can just imagine the people locally were already very frustrated by and angry about the British taxes and some of the restrictions and regulations they were putting on the colonists. And now the British move in 2,000 troops right into their city, and they were just not happy about it. It really just continued to spark the revolution that was coming. So the next event we need to talk about is the Boston Massacre that happened March 5th, 1770, largely because you had all these troops in town who were trying to protect the duties officers. You see a really famous painting there to the right that happened several years after the event itself, where the British troops open up on an American crowd and kill several people. The Boston Massacre marked the moment when political tensions between British soldiers and American colonists actually turned deadly. Patriots argued the event was the massacre of civilians perpetrated by the British Army, while loyalists argued that it was just an unfortunate accident, the result of self-defense of the British soldiers from a threatening and dangerous mob. So it really depended on how you looked at it, whether it was a slaughter or whether it was just an accident. In February 1770, Christopher Sider, who was an 11-year-old boy, was killed while protesting with a group in front of the home of a loyalist. Thousands of Bostonians turned out for the boy's funeral, and the tension and distrust between the civilians and the British grew even larger. The crowd became angrier and angrier over the next couple days. At one point, a club or stick was thrown at the soldiers and struck one of the British soldiers in the face. The soldier fell to the ground. He stood back up and yelled, "Damn you, fire!" and fired his musket into the crowd. The musket ball struck a man who fell dead to the ground instantly. A few seconds later, the other British soldiers fired into the crowd. 11 people were hit, 5 men were killed, and 6 were wounded. After the smoke had cleared, Preston ordered his men to cease fire and called out dozens of soldiers to defend the custom house. Most of the crowd of civilians left the area immediately around the soldiers as others ran to help the wounded and try to get them off the street. American blood had been spilled at the hands of British soldiers for the first time. So you can see this was one of the real major markers within this battle for Boston, battle for American independence. And this is the first time British troops had actually fired on civilians. Of course, they had already fired on soldiers at Lexington, but this continued to escalate the conflict. The next event, of course, very famous, the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. Some great photos there to the right of the Tea Party, where you had hundreds of colonists coming and participating in this event, also put on by the Sons of Liberty, and going and opening up boxes and dumping tea into the ocean. During the Boston Tea Party, defiant colonists dumped crates of tea into Boston Harbor, a culminating event after a series of protests over various British taxes over the previous years. Great Britain had introduced the Tea Act on May 10th, 1773, to reassert itself as the governing authority of the American colonies and spare the East India Company from financial ruin. Dissenters like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty continued to invoke no taxation without representation, and colonial newspapers widely reported the schedule of the first shipment of tea. Some colonial ports persuaded the tea ships to turn back to England, but in Boston, the British governor anticipated the arrival, and the ships entered the harbor. On December 16th, 1773, the day before the tax deadline was coming due, a crowd of thousands gathered at the Old South Meeting House. Later that evening, up to 130 men, most of whom belonged to the Sons of Liberty, boarded the 3 tea ships. Some disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors to conceal their identity. They pried open the 342 chests of tea with axes and dumped the tea overboard into the water. The Boston Tea Party sparked a controversy almost immediately. When the sun rose on December 17th, the next morning, to reveal 342 crates of tea floating in the harbor, the governor condemned it as an act of treason, putting it as an act of defense against British taxation and a last resort to save colonial rights. So what an incredible event this was, an act of defiance put on by the Sons of Liberty and the residents of Boston who were very angry about this act, and essentially were trying to show that you could strike back and push back against the British and their taxes.
December 16th, 1773, Boston Harbor. By the end of the night, 342 chests of tea would be dumped into the harbor. Known as the Boston Tea Party, this event was a protest against taxation and British mercantilism. In some ways, the event had been brewing for 10 years. Following the end of the French and Indian War, Britain wanted to tax the colonies and regain some of the money that had been spent for their protection. This violated two principles. First, the idea that the colonies were governed directly by the king. Second, the theory of mercantilism, which said that a mother country would protect the colonies since they provided a vast amount of income. As Parliament tried to take control and levy taxes, American colonists protested. A series of acts and taxes led to boycotts, protests, and creative resistance. By 1773, Parliament had repealed most of the unpopular tax acts. However, the Tea Act remained. Created by Parliament to financially rescue the floundering East India Tea Company, the Tea Act gave a monopoly and several other financial breaks to the company, allowing them to exclusively sell tea in the American colonies.
Had a brush with the East India Trading Company, did we? Pirate?
When 3 ships of the East India Tea Company stood off Boston Harbor, protesting colonists refused to allow the ships to unload the cargo. But the Royalist governor of Massachusetts refused to allow the ships to leave. On September 16th, the Sons of Liberty reacted. Putting on disguises inspired by the Native American Mohawk tribe warriors, the colonists headed for the harbor. Their costumes had symbolic meaning, since both British and colonials recognized Native Americans as a group that did not want to be ruled by European powers. The disguised Sons of Liberty boarded the 3 ships, and for the next 3 hours diligently unloaded the tea into Boston Harbor. It's estimated that 92,000 pounds of tea were emptied into Boston Harbor that night, and the estimated value of that lost cargo was around $1,700,000 in modern U.S. currency. Samuel Adams, a leader of the Sons of Liberty, insisted that the Boston Tea Party was not the actions of a mob, but rather a protest of colonists who were asserting the idea, no taxation without representation. The British governor, Parliament, and the King viewed the Boston Tea Party as rebellion, and in response instituted the Intolerable Acts, which included closing the Boston Harbor to trade. Though the start of the American Revolution and the shot heard round the world was still more than a year and a half away, the Boston Tea Party was a major moment in the road to rebellion and eventual independence for the American colonies. John Adams, a relative of Samuel Adams, noted in his diary a few days after the Boston Tea Party, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epocha in history."
Coercive acts of 1774, also known as the Intolerable Acts by colonists, were for or often cited a 5th punitive law passed by British Parliament to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. They closed Boston Harbor, suspended local government, and expanded British military authority, directly fueling colonial resistance. The new laws revoked the colony's charter, replaced the elected council with an appointed one, and severely limited town meetings and any assembly of the people. They also allowed royal officials accused of capital crimes to be tried in other colonies or even in Great Britain to avoid local juries. The laws also allowed the governor to house British troops in unoccupied buildings, including private homes. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the acts united the colonies in fear and outrage. All of a sudden, the other 12 colonies were all supporting Massachusetts. This led to a boycott of British goods and the calling of the First Continental Congress in September 1774 to coordinate a resistance strategy across all 13 colonies. So you can see all the different moves the British were making the people angrier and angrier, Massachusetts colony being the first, but now they were being supported by all the other colonies who were just outraged by the way Massachusetts was being treated. You can see a picture there on the right of the Intolerable Acts at the time. And of course, they were called the Coercive Acts officially. So the next thing to talk about is the Suffolk Resolves, which came just after the Coercive Acts in September of 1774. Suffolk Resolves that were approved on September 9, 1774 in Massachusetts and endorsed by the First Continental Congress on September 17th was a bold declaration of resistance against British coercive acts. So the Suffolk Resolves in a lot of ways was the precursor to the Declaration of Independence, just 2 years earlier. Drafted by Dr. Joseph Warren, the Resolves encouraged a boycott, tax refusal, and the formation of militias, accelerating the path to the revolution. This put in place a total boycott of British goods and a refusal to import or consume them, as well as a refusal of British taxes in all 13 colonies. The Resolves specifically declared the British Massachusetts Government Act null and void and set up a continental parallel government to manage Massachusetts. The Resolves encouraged towns to train their militias regularly, forming the basis for the Minutemen. Of course, the famous Minutemen were the militia that was formed all over Massachusetts. You can see a picture of what those Minutemen look like to the top right. And just below that, a picture of the actual Suffolk Resolves as they were written. So really interesting that this teapot of Massachusetts continued to boil and get more and more hot, where the colonists were moving towards revolution. Let's talk about Paul Revere and William Dawes and their famous ride in April 18th, 1775. You see a great picture there to the right of Paul Revere and his famous ride coming out of a very famous book by Longfellow. And then just below that, some of the other riders that went out that day. As I said before, there were over 20 total riders that went all over Massachusetts. So on the night of April 18th, Paul Revere and William Dawes were dispatched by Dr. Joseph Warren, who actually wrote the Suffolk Resolves, from Boston to warn John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and the local militias of advancing British troops. Revere took the sea route across the harbor, while Dawes took the land route over Boston Neck, which was a much further way to go. Both men rode to alert colonists that the regulars are coming out, regulars being the British troops. Revere's ride is more famous due to the Longfellow poem, but Dawes was actually more crucial that night, taking the riskier, longer land route and successfully bypassing British guards. Both of them left around 10 p.m. that night, with Dawes leaving slightly earlier. They met in Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams, who were being sought as traitors by British troops. They wanted to capture them and hang them. Joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott, they continued towards Concord. A British patrol actually captured Revere, but Dawes and Prescott actually escaped and continued their mission. Up to 20 other riders were dispatched to other towns in Massachusetts, including Israel Bissell, who's another one of the famous riders that night. So you can just see how brave these guys were. They were sent out by Dr. Joseph Warren to warn all the different towns to get their militias ready, that the British regulars were coming. And this is one of the major reasons why the regulars were met by troops both in Lexington and in Concord of the militia that were local. Let's talk about Lexington and Concord. This happened April 19, 1775. Of course, the militiamen had been warned. You can see a great painting there to the right, a very famous one in Lexington, on Lexington Green, of the colonials in their first action of the Revolutionary War, fighting against the British regulars that had come into Lexington. The British marched into Lexington and Concord intending to suppress the possibility of rebellion by seizing weapons from the colonists. The colonists' intricate alarm system summoned local militia companies, enabling them to successfully counter the British threat. British troops marched into the small town of Lexington around 5 a.m. in the morning to find themselves faced by a militia company of more than 70 men that was led by Captain John Parker. When the vanguard of British forces rushes towards them across the town green, Parker immediately orders his company to disperse. He realized he was very outnumbered and that they couldn't beat the British. At some point during this melee, a shot rings out. Historians still debate who fired it, whether it was fired by the colonials or by nervous British soldiers. But either way, a volley was fired, and it killed 7 and mortally wounded 1 others, who were the retreating colonial militia. So you had 8 total that were killed. The British column moves forward towards Concord after this skirmish, leaving the dead on the green. In Concord, the Minutemen marched down the hill to the old bridge. You can see a picture there to the right of the old bridge and the Minutemen marching towards it. British soldiers, intimidated by the numbers of the militiamen that had come out that day, retreated to the opposite shore of the old bridge and prepared to defend themselves. When Davis's company comes within range, the Redcoats open fire, killing Davis and Admiral Hosmer. They were the first 2 killed at Concord that day. Major Buttrick of Concord shouts, "For God's sake, fire, men!" And the Minutemen open fire with a volley, killing 3 British soldiers and wounding 9 others. This volley is considered the shot heard round the world. So when you hear that term, they're talking about that first volley that the colonials shot in Concord. And it sent the British troops retreating back to town, to Boston. The Patriots, of course, followed them all the way back to Boston and harassed them all the way, including new sets of troops that were coming out in all the towns on the way back. And of course, that then kicked off the siege of Boston, where they surrounded the city. So pretty amazing to think about these 2 skirmishes and short battles that really kicked off the American Revolution, even though it was a full year before we actually declared independence. If you want to take a look at the very detailed breakdown of Lexington and Concord, we did an episode on this over a year ago, and I'll put that in the description down below. You can watch the full episode about Lexington and Concord and a lot more of the detail. So the next event that took place was the Siege of Boston, now that the Lexington and Concord militia had followed them all the way back to Boston and encircled the city. This siege took place over an entire year from April 75 to March of 76. And the Siege of Boston was George Washington's first campaign as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He had just been named as Commander-in-Chief. Disdain for British troops stationed in North America to enforce royal policies grew among colonists, especially in cities such as Boston. Subsequently, the British occupied Boston at the outbreak of the American Revolution, and eventually as many as 11,000 British troops were stationed there over time. American forces undertook this siege of Boston to force out the British. When the British evacuated the city in March of 1776, there was huge celebrations all across the city. Militias contained the British to Boston in April 75 following the battles of Lexington and Concord. Freeing Boston of British control was an early priority in the war, as it was a critical port and ideological American stronghold. And as we said before, it really was the cradle of liberty, according to the colonials. Americans faced early defeat attempting to advance towards the city in the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 1775. Understanding the need for competent military leadership, the Continental Congress elected Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and he was bound for Boston to contribute to the siege. And of course, he got there and found kind of a ragtag army that was not very organized. The camp was in really bad shape. Their weapons were bad. They didn't have shoes. It was a really bad situation. So one of the things he did during the siege, which went on for a year, was he spent time planning and organizing and drilling and putting his troops together, making them a real fighting force. Let's take a look at a map of Boston during the siege and the surrounding areas. You can see there George Washington, where he was positioned to the left of the city. Just above him, you had General William Powell. Just above that, you had the Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually happened on Breed's Hill. That was that battle that they lost, but really showed a lot of courage in. And then you see Boston City itself there in the middle, where the British were completely surrounded. And then down at the very bottom of the map is the area Dorchester Heights, where the Americans ended up pulling over 50 cannon and pointing them down to the city and eventually forcing the British to evacuate via boat. You can also see one of the ways the British survived the year, and also the loyalists who were loyal to the crown who lived there as well, was they were getting continual shipments of British ships coming in from England and dropping off supplies. And of course, the Americans didn't really have a navy at the time, so they were unable to stop those shipments. So next thing to talk about is that Battle of Bunker Hill. We already mentioned it. Happened on June 17, 1775. Some great pictures there to the right of what this battle looked like for the colonials who were standing their ground on Breed's Hill. They were really pretty poorly armed. They didn't have a lot of ammunition, but very bravely were standing there waiting for the British coming up the hill. You can see the forces that were engaged that day. You had 3,000 British troops coming up the hill at them, and you had 2,200 colonials in this battle. The American Patriots were defeated at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they proved they could hold their own against the superior British army. The fierce fight confirmed that any reconciliation between England and her American colonies was no longer possible. This really was the breaking point. Gage and his commanders ordered British regulars and grenadiers to move across Boston Harbor in ships and disembark in Lower Charlestown. Led by General William Howe, King George's troops climbed Breed's Hill in perfect battle formation. Legend has it that as they advanced, American officer William Prescott cautioned his men not to waste their powder, saying, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So because they had such limited powder and limited ammunition, he really wanted to save the rounds that they had. When British troops neared the redoubt up the hill, the Patriots unleashed a withering volley into the British line, and it was verifiable bloodbath right away. The British retreated back to their lines after losing quite a few men. Once more, the British pushed up the hill, stepping over bodies of their dead and wounded, and again they received another Patriot volley. Finally, on the third try up the hill, and just when the Patriots ran out of powder and shot, the British succeeded in breaking through the Patriot works. Intense hand-to-hand fighting occurred inside the fortifications. The British were victorious, but at a very big cost of men. At some point in the struggle, a black soldier named Salem was credited with killing British Major John Pitcairn, who was the officer despised for allegedly ordering his men to fire on Patriots during the Battle of Lexington and Concord just weeks earlier. It's really interesting that the colonials had not forgotten about Pitcairn. And when he died in the hand-to-hand battle against Salem, there was a lot of celebration that he had been killed during battle. It's really interesting there, Battle of Bunker Hill, a loss, but also gave the colonials some confidence that they could actually fight with this superior army.
After the Lexington Alarm of April 19, 1775, 20,000 militiamen and Minutemen groups from across all of New England converged on Massachusetts and Boston in particular. They were outraged, they were angry, and they bottled up the British inside the city. By the middle of June, their numbers had swollen to the point that General Thomas Gage was concerned about their presence outside of the city. They were led by General Artemus Ward, who was head of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, who on the night of June 15th and 16th ordered his forces forward to this position on Breed's Hill, which we erroneously call Bunker's Hill. His men erected a fortification on this hill that in the morning when the British woke up, looked out, were stunned, and knew something had to be done. After a council of war with his subordinates, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, General Thomas Gage made a decision. He was going to attack the American position located on Breed's Hill. And on the afternoon of June 17, 1775, which was an incredibly hot and humid day, thousands of British grenadiers and regulars embarked across Boston Harbor, disembarked on the shores of Charlestown, and began to assault the American positions here at Bunker Hill. Led by the courageous General William Howe, the British marched off in cadence to drum beats and assaulted the American position. Thousands of British grenadiers and regulars massed in formation at the bottom of this hill. Inside the American fort, American militiamen trained their eyes and they knew the big fight was coming. They could see the gleaming bayonets, they could see the red coats. Allegedly, Colonel William Prescott, one of the defenders inside the fort, ordered his men to not fire until they saw the whites of their eyes. The British marched up in cadence, step by step, inch by inch. They got closer and closer and closer, and when they got within musket range, the Americans issued a withering volley that dropped the British in their ranks in their place, and they retreated back to where they started. Once more, the British marched up the hill. Again, this time, stepping over dead and wounded comrades, they made their assault on the American position. And once again, the Americans fired a withering volley into their ranks. The British once more retreated to their original lines. Finally, on a third assault, again marching over their dead and dying comrades, the British were able to penetrate the American forces, and a severe and fierce firefight broke out inside the fortification. Inside the fortification were several African Americans, including Peter Salem, who saw an officer. He drew a bead on the officer, fired his gun, and took down Major John Pitcairn, who had gained infamy during the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Americans broke and ran, but not because they were afraid, but because they had run out of powder and shot. The British won the field, but as Henry Clinton had said, it was a dear-bought victory. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, reconciliation between the American colonies and Great Britain was no longer possible. Benjamin Franklin wrote a friend in England, "We were once friends, we are now enemies." The war had taken a fateful turn.
Let's talk a little bit more about the taking over as Commander-in-Chief by George Washington, July 3rd, 1776. He was appointed by Congress to lead the rebellion against Britain. He arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 3rd. He took command of the raw, undisciplined forces, transforming it into a cohesive army during the siege of Boston. Nominated by John Adams, Washington was unanimously selected, largely due to his military experience in the French and Indian War and the political necessity of uniting the colonies. His appointment solidified the principle of civilian control over the military, as he reported directly to Congress. Upon taking command, Washington found a mixed multitude of soldiers lacking in discipline, leading him to enforce strict training and military protocol for the next couple of months. He immediately faced a shortage of supplies, gunpowder, and skilled officers. In a few short months, Washington was able to turn this ragtag group of patriots into a fighting force. So incredibly important that Washington took over at this point because, as you can see, it really was moving towards a full-fledged war rather than skirmish. And he came in with a lot of experience and a lot of stature. So Knox, who worked for Washington, Henry Knox, moves the cannon and shells. This happened in November 1775 to January 1776. In the winter, Colonel Henry Knox executed a brilliant 300-mile, 56-day logistical feat, transporting tons of captured British cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, known as the Noble Train of Artillery. That's what they called it. This was an incredible feat because it was during wintertime when there was snow and ice on the ground and they had to cross rivers, and some of those rivers were frozen, some of the lakes were frozen. This was done by Henry Knox, who was a 25-year-old former Boston bookseller turned Continental Army officer. And he began the mission in November 1775. eventually arriving back in Boston with the artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, which, by the way, had been won and taken away from the British. He arrived almost 2 months later, January 25th, 1776. The 60-ton load included 59 guns and mortars and was moved using ox-drawn sleds, horses, and boats over 300 miles of treacherous terrain, including 4 crossings of the frozen Hudson River. On December 17, 1775, Knox wrote to Washington in a letter that he sent ahead with a courier from Lake George, New York, describing the difficulty of transporting the cannon and mortars. It is not easy to conceive of the difficulties we have had in getting them here over the lake, owing to the advanced season of the year and contrary winds. But the danger is now past. 3 days ago, it was very uncertain whether we could have gotten them until next spring. But now, please God, they must go. So really interesting, in that letter there, he wrote to Washington about how difficult this journey was with these 59 cannons and mortars. The cannons were positioned eventually on Dorchester Heights in a single night in early March 1776, directly threatening the British positions down below and their fleet in the Boston harbor. And you can see a picture there to the right of what the cannons look like at Fort Ticonderoga that got removed and transported all the way to Boston. And you see down below some of the ways they were transporting these guns in these oxen-pulled sleds. Incredible feat that they pulled off here. Let's talk about the fortification of Dorchester Heights. This happened March 4th to March 17th, 1776. In addition to artillery, George Washington also needed as many reinforcements as possible to temporarily augment the Continental Army. Units from all across New England formed and marched to Cambridge and Roxbury to surround Boston. In February, Washington and his generals agreed to a strategy to finally dislodge the British from Boston. They recognized the strategic military advantage of fortifying Dorchester Heights, which overlooked the city. But there was a challenge. How would the army fortify the heights undetected? Using the additional artillery that Knox had recovered, Washington ordered a large bombardment of Boston from every single angle to divert attention of the British forces to the west of the town. So he literally created a diversion by having a cannon bombardment from a different area. Finally, on the night of March 4th, 1776, Washington directed General John Thomas and Colonel Richard Gridley, the chief engineer of the army, to fortify the heights of Dorchester, and to do it in one night. Over 1,200 soldiers and volunteers and 360 ox carts transported tools, materials to the site as stealthily as possible. And what's interesting is they actually used big bales of hay, big columns of bales of hay, and they rolled the weapons behind the bales of hay so the British wouldn't see them. Did all of this in the middle of the night. It was really quite a feat to fortify this area.
Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. All the skill and experience in the world can't help British forces tame the chaos in the colonies. Thomas Gage now has only 7,000 soldiers, surrounded by Washington's 16,000.
The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. Small armies can't afford such losses. The rebels' number is great, so many hands have been employed. I wish this cursed place was burned. Thomas Gage.
October 11th, 1775. Without fanfare and without honors, General Thomas Gage is relieved of his command. Once Britain's most powerful man in America, he returns home alone and disgraced. General William Howe steps into Gage's boots and is already knee-deep in the American quagmire. In London, King George roundly rejects the Olive Branch Petition, Continental Congress's last grasp for peace. On October 26th, in his annual speech to Parliament, the king throws down the gauntlet.
It has now become the part of wisdom to put a speedy end to these disorders by the most decisive exertions. King George III.
What the king wants is a military solution to a political problem, but his call for war is anything but unanimous among Britain's people and politicians. But when Parliament votes, war carries the day. The military is ordered to send thousands more troops and a full armada to quell America's escalating revolution. All seems lost, even before it's begun, until a former bookseller has an idea that will change everything. January 1st, 1776. It's a new year for a new army, and General Washington raises a new flag to commemorate it, the Grand Union, with 13 stripes representing both the differences and common cause of the 13 colonies, and with the British Union Jack in the upper left to acknowledge those colonial leaders hoping to salvage a relationship with England. That same day, the colonies get the news of the King's October proclamation to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. It's a stunning declaration by the King that rouses rebel ire more than ever. But an army needs more than anger to fight a war. With the onset of winter, neither side has the supplies necessary to brave the cold and snow. The British hole up in Boston, waiting for reinforcements and supplies from England, while Washington uses the time to piece together an army short on everything, from manpower to gunpowder. But help is on the way. Henry Knox, a 25-year-old colonel and former Boston bookseller, is leading a trek from Cambridge to Fort Ticonderoga on a quest for arms. Knox has taken it upon himself to recover the artillery captured from the British at Fort Ticonderoga. For 2 months, in the cold and wet, he, his men, and teams of oxen haul 120,000 pounds of artillery across 300 miles of muddy woods, frozen rivers, and steep, icy slopes back to headquarters in Cambridge. On January 25th, Colonel Knox delivers all of the weaponry to his commander-in-chief, miraculously intact. It is the best gift Washington could ever receive. Finally, he has the firepower he so badly needs. Washington also has in Knox a valued new commander in charge of artillery. Knox becomes part of Washington's inner circle of junior officers, whose counsel he values enormously.
George Washington always had the ability to listen to many people, particularly younger men. He thinks everybody's view is important, that it's a part of the puzzle, that people know things that he doesn't know, and if he can listen to enough opinions, he'll know as much as they do. A hallmark of good leadership.
Right away, Washington's brain trust keeps him from making a fatal mistake. As the spring thaw approaches, Washington wants to send waves of foot soldiers down into Boston in a full frontal attack. But his officers overrule him. The British are too well fortified, and the Continentals are still short of gunpowder. They do, however, have Knox's artillery. They decide to take the highest ground, Dorchester Heights, and bombard the city. March 2nd. After months of waiting, Washington and his men are more than eager to move. The general is about to launch the first offensive of his command. He sends a stern warning to his troops.
Our posterity depends upon the vigor of our exertions. If any man in action shall presume to skulk, hide himself, or retreat from the enemy without the orders of his commanding officer, he will be instantly shot down as an example of cowardice. General Washington.
The night of March 4th. Surprise will be the key. From 3 points outside the city, Cobble Hill, Lechmere, and Roxbury, the Army rains light cannon fire down on Boston. A decoy to misdirect the British, while the rest of the Army hauls Knox's artillery over to Dorchester Heights. Through the night, Washington's men build fortifications and drag cannon up the steep, frozen slope. By morning, everything is in place. Daybreak, March 5th. On the 6th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, the British awake to the sight of 20 cannon pointed down on their ships in the harbor. "My God," a shocked Howe exclaims, "these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months."
It's not until after they see Ticonderoga's guns on Dorchester Heights that they realize they got to get the heck out of there.
The Continentals don't even need to fire a shot. Howe issues a futile order for his ship's cannon to fire on the Continental position, but Washington's guns sit just out of range. Luckily for Howe, his ships are also out of Washington's range. Howe and his army prepare to abandon the city and take thousands of Loyalist citizens with them. One Loyalist would later write,
"The necessary care of the women, sick and wounded, required every assistance that could be given. It was not like the breaking up of a camp, where every man knows his duty. It was like departing your country, with your wives, your servants, your household furniture, and all your encumbrances."
Over the next 2 weeks, the Continentals watch from above as all of Boston scrambles to evacuate, taking everything with them that isn't nailed down. It is a bitter exile for the Loyalists, many of whose families had lived in Boston for generations. By March 17th, they are all gone. 120 ships carry 9,000 redcoats, 2,000 Loyalists, and as many of the city's usable goods as possible, out to an unknown fate. The Patriots return to the city, the beloved birthplace of the rebellion, and Washington enjoys the first victory of his command. But it will be his last for the rest of a grueling and humiliating year. 1776 will see 33,000 British troops, the largest contingent ever sent overseas, head for America to grind the revolution into dust.
So the next morning, the dawn of March 5th, 1776, which was the 6th-year anniversary of the Boston Massacre, revealed to everyone what the Continental forces had achieved overnight. A fortification with cannon towered over Boston, as well as the only shipping routes out of the harbor. British General William Howe commented, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." Howe planned an attack in response to this aggressive act by the colonial forces, yet a storm prevented an immediate response. Having been surrounded by Washington's army, Howe recognized he was at a military disadvantage and determined to remove his troops from the city. On March 17th, 1776, British forces evacuated Boston, along with over 1,000 colonial loyalists. The Patriots had taken Boston without bloodshed. This quiet military operation on Dorchester Heights not only led to the evacuation of British troops, but also effectively ended the siege of Boston. After marching into Boston on March 18th, so the next day, Washington prepared to move his army to New York, anticipating the focus of the war to shift there. You see a picture there to the right of William Howe, the British commander, and then you see down below there, that was Washington and his men and his officers entering Boston for the first time since it was undefended. So really, what an incredible thing for the colonials to have this strategy where they created a siege all around the city, and they eventually had this position at Dorchester Heights that had true supremacy over the city and the harbor. And the British looked at that and realized they could not win. and decided to leave without a shot being fired. Really remarkable. So securing Boston, this happened between March 20th and April 4th of 1776. Once the British fleet had sailed away, the Americans moved in to reclaim Boston and Charlestown. At first, they thought the British were still on Bunker Hill, but it turned out the British had actually left dummies in place that looked like humans. What an interesting diversion they tried to do to the Americans. Initially, Artemus Ward led a troop of men into Boston who had already been exposed to smallpox, out of fear that others might be exposed who had no resistance to the disease. Most of the colonial army entered on March 20th, once the risk of disease was judged to be very low. Washington had not hindered the British departure from the city by land, but he did not make their escape easy from the outer harbor. He directed Captain Manley to harass the departing British fleet, in which he had some success capturing the ship carrying Crean Brush and his plunder, among other prizes. General Howe left in his wake a small contingent of vessels whose primary purpose was to intercept any arriving British vessels from England. They redirected numerous ships to Halifax that were carrying British troops and originally destined for Boston. Some unsuspecting British troop ships landed in Boston only to fall into American hands and helping the Americans to resupply themselves. The British departure ended major military activities in the New England colonies and really would not resume again. So in effect, the New England War was over before the Declaration even happened. Washington feared that the British were going to attack New York City, and so he departed April 4th with his army for Manhattan, beginning the New York and New Jersey campaign. You can see a picture there to the right of them leaving the city of Boston on April 4th, heading to New York. And then a great picture down below there, Washington was actually awarded the first ever Congressional Gold Medal, or Congressional Medal of Honor, in 1790 for his first victory in the War of Boston. So what a cool thing that he got the first Congressional Medal because of this action and because of the strategy he and his men were able to employ. Well, hopefully you enjoyed learning a lot more about the Battle for Boston, all the different events that led up to it, 1768 to 1776. You can see there were many different events that really were triggering the war itself as it was coming slowly over those 9 years. The colonials getting more and more angry every year. The English continued to make many, many mistakes in how they handled the colonies, and especially Massachusetts. And they were just putting more and more taxes and more regulations and trying to clamp down on the colonials. And it was just having the opposite effect of what the British were trying to do, which was to calm things down. And you can see eventually all the way to the siege of Boston and then eventually Dorchester Heights. The Americans finally got the upper hand and were able to clear the British essentially from New England. And they had captured New England for good. So really gave you a good sense there all the way back to the 1768 event, the 1770 Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the coercive and intolerable acts, and then all the different things that happened after that with Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, and then eventually the siege. So again, hopefully you enjoyed that. You enjoyed the video clips that we showed as well, and that you want to dig some more into this really important period in the American Revolution leading up to the Declaration of Independence, which was all the action that was happening in the Massachusetts colony and in Boston. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot more great content coming your way, and we really love giving you these great Patriot stories as this is the 250th year of the United States. We hope you love history as much as we do, and we'll see you next time on Traveling Through History. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.